I would like to acknowledge the Guringai people and pay my respects to the elders both past and present. The Guringai people are the traditional owners of this land where we meet today. Andra Putnis is the author of Stories My Grandmothers Didn't Tell Me. This poignant book uncovers and reflects on the hidden narratives of her grandmothers, who were both survivors of World War II in Latvia. Andra's quest to record these silent histories was not just about preserving the past, but understanding the depths of the experiences that have shaped her family.
Welcome to Sharing Stories, Changing Lives. The host, Karen Sander, has the privilege of interviewing individuals from all walks of life, each with their own powerful and inspiring stories. The guests share their life experiences, and in doing so, they celebrate the transformative magic of storytelling. To learn more, visit www.thestoryroom.au and explore the private membership area, the Backstage Pass.
Welcome, Andra.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Well, congratulations on telling the stories of your grandmother's life. You must be so proud to have been on this journey.
Thank you so much. I do feel proud, and I hope that my grandmothers would be proud of me.
I'm sure they would be, because grandmothers have a special relationship with their grandchildren because, they don't go through all the hard bits of raising them. They can hand them back. They actually get to be it's just a different relationship.
I think it's a very special relationship. I'd love to tell you about my grandmothers. They were two remarkable but very different women. My grandma Milda, who's my mother's mother, she was born in 1913 outside of Riga, Latvia's capital. And she was Lutheran and was essentially kind of an aspiring middle-class woman, and she'd built quite an exciting life for herself before the war came. She'd married quite a handsome, eligible bachelor and was enjoying some of the finer things in life, like, good food and going to restaurants and the opera. And she really loved her city. She loved Riga. She went through quite horrific times during the war, as the book kind of details, but she emerged quite a strong and forthright woman. And she really loved fashion. She was an excellent sewer. She could do anything with a needle. She could sew leather coats, dresses, piles of ballet costumes for my mother and then myself and my sisters. But she also was able to create these amazing Latvian tapestries. They were cross-stitched, huge amount of kind of wool in these, think kind of a 3x4 metre tapestry with lots of kind of Latvian designs and patterns. They were really very beautiful. My nana Alena, on the other hand, she was my dad's mother. She was born in 1924, so she was a lot younger where the war came to Latvia. She was only a teenager. And she was a very humble person and was from a kind of Catholic farming type background. And her family was very religious. And I think that meant that she grew up kind of wondering a little bit, questioning and wondering about whether she'd made the right decisions in her life. She was a very reflective person and very warm person. She also went through really challenging times, but because she was that much younger, she had a very different journey.
When you decided to write the book, what was the initial spark or the moment that got you going to dive into your grandmother's past, considering there was an unspoken family code of not to dig too deep?
Yes, well, I grew up quite close to both of my grandmothers, so I knew they had really big stories. I didn't know exactly what they were. I had glimpses all through my childhood of kind of, I suppose you'd say, aspects of wondering about kind of folk dancing and Riga and ideas of kind of Latvia and beautiful forests and almost a fairy tale kind of image of the place. But I also had a lot of, I suppose you'd say, fear about what had happened there with the Soviet and Nazi occupations and deportations and things. So I knew there were stories there from a very young age. Actually, would you believe it was in Darwin? I was at the Writers' Festival in Darwin around 2005, and I have always wanted to try and write something. And I had been going to all these amazing workshops and hearing all of these amazing stories. And I remember I was looking out over the Arafura Sea, which is beautiful, kind of milky aqua colour. And I was on the lawns of the Museum and Art Gallery of Darwin, and it's very green and lots of pandanus trees around and things. And I asked myself the question, a really serious question, if you were to have a go, what would you try and write? And I knew immediately that I would try to write the stories of my grandmothers. I did have quite quickly after that this lurching feeling because of this kind of unspoken code, not to dig too deep. I had this lurching feeling of, would that be the right thing to do? Would I be able to handle it? Would I kind of upset people in my family? I really didn't want to kind of cause any disruptions. And when I was growing up, sometimes I did feel there was this sense of, better to let sleeping dogs lie. It's too hard to bring these things up. So I was nervous, but I also thought, well, I'm older now, and if I want to find out their stories, now is the time. Otherwise, I won't ever know. I thought, right, well, I'll go down and I'll visit my nana, Aline, and I'll ask her. And so I remember being in her kitchen. Her kitchen it was kind of preserved as if it's a 1950s kitchen with a kind of formica table and all these 1950s canisters, saying flour, sugar, salt around and those sorts of things. And we were sitting there, and I told her what I wanted to do and asked her. And she asked a few good questions. Why? What do you want to know? Is it about me? What really do you want to know? And we had a good conversation about it. And then she said, okay. And then that was that. We just started. And that was the way in. And my nana turned out to be a master storyteller.
And Milda, did you have a similar conversation with Milda?
I didn't, unfortunately, because she passed away when I was 19. So she lived with my family from when I was about 10 years old. So I had a huge kind of, I suppose, history of sitting beside her and speaking with her. And so I had some of her stories and memories, particularly ones that were kind of before the war and things that she really enjoyed talking about. But I wasn't able to ask her directly at that point, and I had to go on a really long journey to remember what I already knew, talk to other family members and her friends, and go through historical archives. And she had quite a lot of correspondence, and she kept a lot of things, lots of letters and lists and things like this. And I knew her very well. So that gave me the confidence to think, okay, it's about both of my grandmothers. It's about both of their stories.
In your book, you're sharing their stories, and there's one particular story you talk about, a festival.
The story of Nana Aline, and she was only 15 at the time, and there are these big song festivals in Latvia, and they're absolutely huge events. They're crowds of kind of 10,000 people on stage singing, and the sound is absolutely incredible. On the 16th of June 1940, there was one of these song festivals to be held in Daugavpils, which was quite close to where Nana and her family lived in Kraslava. And so she begged her mother to be able to go. And she went with her father, who was a church organist. With her other friends and people in the Kraslava choir, they went to the song festival. She told me the story of how she had kind of flowers in her hands that it was very warm, so they're actually kind of wilting a little bit in her hands as she had to file to get ready with everybody else kind of in rows on the sort of stage. She was extremely excited to be there. And the Latvian president was meant to also attend because he was meant to open the song festival and the celebrations. What happened was there was a crackling over the loudspeakers, and then there was an announcement that the president would address the country from Riga. And Essentially, he said that it was tense times and he had to stay at his post and he wasn't going to be able to be with them because there were very serious conversations going with the Soviet Union about the country and how they would kind of be alongside one another. And from the speech, people knew what he was alluding to. He was alluding to the fact that the Soviets were about to invade Latvia. Lana was kind of there, and of course, as a teenager looking around trying to understand what's going on, and the crowd was all moving, and she felt very unsettled and was holding on to her best friend Marta's hand. Then the conductor down the front waved, and they all got ready, and he led them in singing the Latvian national anthem 3 times. And when she told the story, she was really emphasised this 3 times, that they sang it 3 times. And as you can imagine, it was very moving and people were overwhelmed and crying and hugging and things like that. And it was the next day that the Soviet forces crossed the border of Latvia. And I feel that when she told me this story, the thing that was most significant to me is that I'd always imagined that my grandmothers were on the edge of the events in Latvia or the Second World War. I'd always sort of thought, well, because they'd come to Australia and our family was safe, that somehow they might have been tucked away somewhere. I don't know what I thought, but I didn't ever understand that, of course, they, like everybody else, was in the middle of it, that they were there for those momentous events and that they had those stories and so many others sitting inside them that I hadn't known as a child.
You held many interviews and conversations with your grandmothers and the Latvian family and friends. How did uncovering such intense personal stories affect you emotionally?
I think the first thing I would say is that most of the time I was really focused on the emotions of the people telling me the stories. That was my most, I suppose, the most important thing to me, because I sort of always felt that if people were telling me these stories, then I would have to just be able to listen to them, be able to be present and listen to them. And if they could handle it, I could handle it. I had that sort of sense all the time. But hearing the stories did have a huge impact on me. Like they opened my eyes, I suppose, to how life can be and the intensity of life and the highs and the terrible, unthinkable lows, like you say. And for being a granddaughter in Australia, you don't understand. And nor should children understand those unthinkable lows. But now I was the kind of, in my late 20s, I could have those conversations. But often I find my body really shaking kind of with it all. I'll give you kind of a bit of an example. What happened in Latvia was in June 1941, there was a mass deportation of Latvians to gulags in Siberia, and men and also women and children were taken. And my grandma Milda hid in a cupboard when some men came to the flat to take her lodger away. And she was there for hours, kind of straining to hear if they were kind of sitting there waiting for her. And when I learned that story, I just really couldn't process it initially. And I think it was actually more in my body, than my brain. And I did feel this sort of sense of deep shaking and trying to kind of understand what it was that I was being told. And I really had this sense of how could this be, and I didn't know about it. The christening of the Jewish children in Kraslova, that was another story. I just thought, I can't believe that story is in my family. What had happened was Nana Arline told me one night, and I remember we were sitting kind of in her lounge room, and we were kind of in the lamplight, and both sitting kind of close together. And I often would surround myself with all her Latvian pillows and things to feel kind of a bit maybe safer, a bit cozy. And
I can understand that.
yeah. And the story was that when she was about 17, some women that she knew were involved with trying to christen Jewish children in the Catholic faith in the hope that might keep them safe. they asked my Nana Alina to be a part of one of these christenings. And so she told me that story, and that she, could remember the children and placing her hands on the children's shoulders, and the old kind of altar was all set up, quite properly, and things. And I learnt the story, and then I actually went and did some more research, and I found in a Latvian newspaper an article that talked about those times and the christening of Jewish children in Kraslava. And I just really was kind of stunned. So I suppose you'd say it was an emotional roller coaster, but at all times I sort of felt if other people are willing to tell me these stories now, then, I'm willing to listen to them.
If you're interested in getting more involved in our community, connecting with people who share your interests, you can do this by visiting our website at www.thestoryroom.au.
So what was it like the very first time you went to Latvia, and what was one of the most surprising discoveries that you made while you were researching?
Well, the first thing was a huge relief, because the first time I went to Latvia, it was as if I had stepped into a fairy tale. There's obviously all these really difficult stories, but it really, I went in summer, in the European summer, and the Jaanu Diena festival was on, which is a summer solstice St. John's Day festival. It's one of the biggest festivals in the year in Latvia. And I remember I saw my parents there. They had arrived before me, and we rushed into one of the main central squares of Riga, through the cobblestone streets. And there was the most amazing scene of lots of people in folk dancing costumes, and there was people playing fiddles, and the korkle, which is a little small harp that sits on people's laps. It's a really beautiful instrument. It was food and dancing, and around me all these buildings, these old churches and beautiful Art Nouveau buildings. And I thought, oh my goodness, this has been here all along. It's funny to say, but I didn't really understand fully Latvia as a real country until I went there for myself. And that was the most surprising thing, that it had existed all along, and that I was able to now learn about it more, understand it. And it was this balance of fear and wonder. It was this beautiful place, a fairy tale place, as well as this place of kind of heaviness. That was the most surprising thing, because I think actually when I was younger, the heaviness sort of overtook the wonder. And so it was a beautiful thing to discover.
You must feel very connected to Latvia.
Yes, but it's a journey, I'd say. I'd say I'm still learning. And I do feel connected to Latvia, but it was through my grandmothers, if that makes sense. My first gut instinct was to really understand about my family. And through understanding my family, now I've got, improving my Latvian language skills and learning a lot more. And I feel like there's this whole world and exploration that's opened up to me.
What were your thoughts on the importance of preserving these stories for future generations, and how's it changed your understanding of your family and of yourself?
I feel really lucky to have gotten the stories of my grandmothers and to know them. And over time, it took me a really long time, this book. It took me 15 years, so it was a gradual process. But now I feel that I know what came before me. And that's a profound thing. And it's kind of subtle in a way. I feel a bit more like I understand where I am, kind of in the arc of my family history, and it's sort of even in the arc of life. I have much more context. Often you've always got that forwards rush of life, and you're trying to move on, and you're doing things and having kids yourself, and it's always onwards, onwards, onwards. And the fact that I sort of paused and looked back makes me feel really more settled. So that was one thing. And I think I also now understand life can be really, really hard. and it was for my grandmothers, and it could be for me in the future. And while that's a bit scary, it also feels deep to understand that too, to really understand the ups and downs of life and the fact that my grandmothers came through such difficult times and ended up with such joy in their lives is a really beautiful thing to know. And so I'm now subsequently a big advocate for people finding out family stories. And it might not be people's grandmothers. Of course, some people don't have that opportunity. Their grandparents might have passed. So it might be parents or aunts or uncles. But I think knowing where you fit in can really just be such a beautiful thing. It increases the richness, I think, and depth of life. And you start to wonder a bit more about everybody's stories around you.
Yeah. Quite often, Andra, we don't find out people's stories until we go along to a funeral or a celebration of life. And
Mm.
we go, well, I didn't know that about someone. And I think that's
Oh,
where what you're doing and sharing your grandmother's stories is so important because they're not lost. And it's now in a written form, so it can't be lost.
I so agree. And I've had that exact experience of going to funerals and feeling exactly like that. I think my nana, one of the most important things she ever said to me and was really meant the world to me was she said to me that my granddaughter took the time to see me, to really see me. And it was a real gift, her saying that, because she said that after we'd had a deep conversation about all of the ups and downs of all of this process and that, that it was hard. It was a real gift for her to let me tell her stories in this way. I think that's right. I think it's really wonderful to kind of see people. And whenever that happens, hopefully when people are still alive or when they've passed away, I think that's the most kind of important thing of all. And I remember actually when we were getting ready for Nana Alina's funeral, I was really worried about whether we would honour her life properly. And she talked a lot about how she wanted things to be. And I was nervous that we would rush through that process somehow, that we wouldn't give it the weight it deserved. I mean, she was born in 1924 and she passed away in 2021. That's a lot of life to honour. And, I remember at one point I thought to myself, oh my gosh, well, I might not do everything right, of course, but I should be in a pretty good position to be able to think about her funeral because I have spent a long time learning about her life. That was a nice realization.
Looking back on this journey of writing a book, with all the hurdles and the emotional moment, what goes through your mind?
It was really hard. I have to be honest, it was really hard sometimes. And a few times I thought, I don't know if I can do this. Maybe I can't actually handle such kind of weighty topics and do this well. I was worried. What sticks with me now is that it was really worth it. I'm really glad. It's made my life much richer. And as I share it with others, others can connect to it. Other Latvians, other people in my family. It feels like a really, I suppose, something full of love. It's what I wrote came from a place of love, and that's overwhelmingly how I feel. I feel extremely lucky to have such a beautiful family and for people to have shared so much with me. And the fact that my family's allowed me to do this is something I'm so grateful for. And we'll see kind of what happens next. But my overwhelming feeling is it's something that is a marvelous thing to try and do if people want to try.
If someone wanted to do this, what advice would you give them? What encouragement would you give them?
A couple of things. First thing I would say is don't bite it all off in the one go. That's just impossible. The only reason I managed to get through all of this was because I started with small steps. I collected small vignettes, stories that Nana Alina in particular wanted to share initially. And I just collected them one by one and one by one. And I just kind of kept going. And that was a really lovely way in. I didn't start out with some big grand plan or trying to do piles of research. I just started with beautiful, simple stories. And they felt like little precious, fragile baubles. And it was manageable. And because she was such a great storyteller, each one I just thought, I can't believe this. Each time she would tell me something new. And that is a beautiful way in. And that's something achievable. Whoever you're talking to, it's those little slices of life and precious stories. That's the way in. For me, it was anyway. And then, of course, it became more complex after that as I started to do all of the research and apply to kind of things like the National Archives of Australia to get all of their records and, all of that stuff. But that came later. And I'm really happy that I did it that way, because I think if I'd have started with all the facts and I've got to get all the dates and I've got to get this and that and this and that, I just think that would have been a bit overwhelming. It's the beautiful stories, and whether you write them or not, it doesn't matter. It's just those lovely stories that are so precious, and it's often about the small details, isn't it? Like I remember Nana Alina, she had a story, it's quite sad, when she was in Australia by this stage, and she ended up separated from her parents, unfortunately, during the war. So when the Iron Curtain came down, she was in Germany and they were left in Latvia. She was in displaced people's camps in Germany. She managed to get to Australia. And once she was able to find her parents again and start corresponding, she found out that her mother was really very, very poor. Her mother wrote a phrase that she was poor like Mrs. Bergmanis. Nana knew what that meant, that Mrs. Bergmanis had been a beggar. And so Nana was obviously horrified. And she would go into the shops in the centre of Newcastle to try to pick scarves out, like silk scarves, that she would be able to put in a letter, between the pages of a letter, really thinly, so that her mother could sell them in Latvia. And she told me how she would really worry about which patterns to choose, which would be the most successful patterns for her mother to sell, and how she would take the scarves out of the packets and really iron them thinly as she could, and make sure that the edges of the scarves were not curled up at all with the heat of the iron. And she'd always wash her hands before she did this so that she didn't get any dirt on these scarves, and she would send them and hope that they got through to her mother in the mail. And that's what I mean about a glass bauble, that you learn this story and, I remember the ironing board. It's the same one that was there when I would visit Nana, and then think, I'm glad I know that. I'm glad I know that happened, as hard as it is.
She was meticulous, wasn't she, in how she packaged this and prepared it to send to her mother. That's amazing. And the detail you have to share and tell.
I think it just all came from her. She just was such a great storyteller. And I think it was a real ritual. She did it very often. And so she could tell these stories, I suppose, in a fully formed way, because she'd reflected on them a lot. I suppose she'd really thought about her life. And so when it came to talk to me about it, she could describe things in those terms, in very detailed terms. And as she got older, she would always say that it was the things that had happened to her earliest in life that she had the clearest memories of.
Andra, I can hear the satisfaction in your voice that you have managed to do this, but having to do the research and to tell stories from many, many years ago about hardships in life and surviving the war and coming to Australia and starting a new life must have been very, very difficult. But so well done you.
Thank you. I think I got too far into the whole thing to give it up. I sort of trapped myself. That's the only reason I think that I kept going, because I'd invested so much, and everyone else, of course, around me, all my family and people had invested so much, that I sort of had to keep going.
Sometimes, they do say when you're going to write a book or do something like that, tell the world, because then you can't back out.
Exactly. That's exactly what happened to me. I did do that. I told people. That was my mistake.
Well, it was some advice that was given to me, actually. Just tell people because they'll hold you accountable. You can't back out once
Exactly.
you've opened your mouth and said, I'm doing it.
That was exactly right, Karen. Yeah.
So for now, Andra, we're going to say goodbye to those that are listening, and you and I are going backstage for a chat. We're going to
Oh,
take the
exciting.
curtain out the back. We're going to sit down in a nice comfy chair and we're going to have a cup of tea.
Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for tuning in to Sharing Stories, Changing Lives. We'd like to invite you to support us by purchasing a Backstage Pass, costing about the same as 2 cups of coffee each month. With the Backstage Pass, you'll gain access to workshops and exclusive content, including videos from our live events. You can do this by visiting our website at www.thestoryroom.au. We can continue to show that sharing stories changes lives.